Joining me now is Steve Gorman, who was the drummer in the Black Crowes, who now plays with Trigger Hippy. And before we talk about some of the Black Crow stuff in your book, I saw your tweet, Steve, and it was talking about Eddie Van Halen, which is kind of why I have you here. And you say, there will be many, many words written and spoken about Eddie Van Halen over the next few days, weeks, months, and years. Those millions of words will never come close to expressing what he meant to rock music, what he meant to guitarists, and what he meant to the guitar itself. That's a pretty powerful statement, Mr. Gorman. What did Eddie, in your mind, mean to rock music?
Well, I think it's pretty simple. You can say that he and Jimi Hendrix are the two guys that truly and only are the two guys that move the needle, for the guitar itself. I mean, Hendrix came out of a blues-based scene and took the playing and the tones he could get to a new place. But Eddie Van Halen really almost came in from another country, another planet, I should say. He's like an alien life form. I mean, he was a virtuosic player, obviously, but he reinvented what you could do with the guitar. And the fact of the matter is this. It, like Hendrix, but even to a greater degree, anybody that tries to play like Eddie Van Halen just sounds like a mime or a mimic. It's like Rich Little doing Johnny Carson. Okay, yeah, that kind of sounds like him, but nobody's ever been able to do what Eddie Van Halen did and make it feel a certain way. You know what I mean? Eddie's and he was that way at 22. I mean, this is not a guy it's not like David Blaine's magic tricks where he gets bigger and better every year. He started with card tricks that other people did first. Eddie Van Halen hit the ground running with Van Halen 1, playing an instrument that had been around for centuries, unlike anybody else had ever done. I mean, he was on the Mount Rushmore of great guitar players at 22 years old. And then he stuck around for another 40 years, still playing, unlike anybody before or since. So I just think that in terms of, sheer, unique mindset and ambition combined with just great talent, obviously, but also a phenomenal work ethic. I mean, he's just a complete unicorn in every sense of the word.
How would you describe his guitar sound? And I say that I know what I think of it, but I just missed Van Halen. Like, I came around right as you guys were blowing up, honestly. So that, for me, the Van Halen was slightly classic rock, slightly old rock to me as a 90s kid. So as someone, because you're just a few years older than I am, but how would you describe his guitar sound as someone who was in it and living it and loving Van Halen?
Well, I can tell you this. I was 13 years old the first time I heard Van Halen. And I remember it. I remember where I was. I remember who I was with. It was going home from school in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. You Really Got Me. Their Kinks, their cover of the Kinks song came on the radio. And it was playing already. And I said, "Hey, Mom, turn that up." It was me and my mom and my friend Brooke Lawson, the three of us in a car. And she turned it up. And my first thought was, that must be like a live version of the Kinks song. And I was thinking, they don't rock that hard, do they? But when it hit that solo, and then by the time the song ended, I realized, well, that's not Ray Davies singing. This is clearly a cover version. But what on earth is this? And it was like making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. This is at a time when I thought punk rock was the coolest thing in the world. And the truth is, Van Halen was more punk than the punks, because they were truly breaking down a bunch of barriers, if you will, or they were going in their own sort of way. There hadn't been a band like Van Halen since Led Zeppelin in terms of rock band hits the ground running at full steam, and it obliterates everything in their path in a certain sense. And to me, Van Halen sounded like what California was in my head. As soon as I heard about them, they're from LA. And as soon as I saw David Lee Roth, and then as soon as I heard more than, the next thing I heard was Eruption, the guitar solo. And, hearing just two pieces of their first album and seeing what they look like, it felt brand new, and it already felt like they're going to be around forever. You just knew from the jump, and this is me as a 13-year-old kid who is obsessed with music, this band is one of the all-timers. Like, there's nothing like this, and they all have the chops. And the other thing, too, as long as I'm just rambling incessantly, Eddie Van Halen was a great rhythm player. It wasn't just about the solos. He led the band rhythmically, and he's also, it needs to be noted, not that it's not obvious, he's a hell of a songwriter. I mean, he really was, as I said before, he's a true unicorn. I mean, just nothing like it. What does it sound like to you?
It sounds frequent and right in the zone. You know, when you're playing something that you're in the same key, that's one thing. Because I play a little bit. I don't play even as good as my friends who are real life musicians, but it's perfect frequency. And not frequency as in the tone but as much, because it's a lot. I mean, Brad Paisley plays. I know it's Brad Paisley because I hear the chicken picking. He has a very distinct sound. And again, I didn't catch Van Halen as it was kind of happening in my childhood. But when I hear a Van Halen song, even if I don't know who it is, if I just hear the guitar part, I hear the Eddie Van Halen because how fast he shreds, but the pattern that he does it, you can just tell by his fingers. And it's kind of, again, it's hard to explain when you ask about music, but that's what I think about it. And I always try to prepare analogies. And most of the people that listen to this podcast here are between 22 to 40. And if you were to make an analogy to another band, it's going to be tough because, listen, Van Halen was massive, but who later on had the kind of impact or reflected the mass listening that Van Halen had?
Well, you mean what bands?
What band could we look at now or in the last 10 years and see, okay, well, that's how big Van Halen was to the people that were the kids in the 80s?
Well, Van Halen hit in the late 70s. 10 years later, you had Guns N' Roses. 6 years after that, you had Nirvana and Pearl Jam. As far as what it is in the 2000s, honestly, I wouldn't know. I haven't seen any young bands that, to me, have broken new ground or gone anywhere with playing. The other thing about Eddie Van Halen you got to recognize is, that's the beginning of the end of music being played with human hands on wooden instruments. I mean, as a general rule, there's still great rock and roll music being made today, but for the last 20, 30 years, electronic music has lived side by side. Computer generated, beat-driven music has lived side by side with rock and roll, and in fact overtaken it. So when Eddie Van Halen broke through, that was still just what everybody did. They played instruments, and he's the guy who showed up. What is it? The Malcolm Gladwell says you need 10,000 hours to be great at something. He showed up like at 100,000 hours, and there hasn't been a musician in the world of rock music in the last 25, 30, I can't think of a single person you say set the entire genre on its ear. I mean, Eddie Van Halen literally did that. He obliterated what it meant to be a great guitar player for a few years. It really set off the equilibrium of the music industry. I mean, he was a genuine earthquake, much the same way 10 years earlier Jimi Hendrix had been, and that's the only two that come to mind that you can say had that kind of impact. I heard somebody else today say that, the two greatest, most significant pieces of technology in the second half of the 20th century were the electric guitar and the television. And as soon as the Jump video hit the airwaves, all of a sudden Eddie Van Halen was in control of both. When you take a guy like that and put him on MTV in those videos, man, forget it. There was just nobody that could touch him and come close. And listen, I'm a drummer, and you mentioned Brad Paisley. Ask Brad Paisley what Eddie Van Halen meant. A lot of the great country players of today, Keith Urban and all sorts of players, they grew up listening to Van Halen records. There's not as big a landscape for a guy to play a guitar and get a paycheck in the world of rock music as there is in country music. And there's a lot of guys who are making a lot of money playing guitar in country music right now grew up listening to rock records first. And of all those guys, Eddie was always the guy. He's always been the gold standard.
Did you ever have a chance to meet Eddie or any of the guys in Van Halen?
I met David Lee Roth several times, but he's the only. The Pete Angelus, who managed the Black Crowes, he started with Van Halen as their creative director from before they had a record deal. He directed all their videos. He designed all their lights. He played a big part in their stage persona. He was, creatively speaking, very much a member of that organization, and in the David Lee Roth era, was thought of by a lot of people as the fifth member of Van Halen. So I know an awful lot about that story. Through Pete, I met Dave in the early 90s several times. But I know a lot of people who've worked with Van Halen over the years. I mean, I've heard enough stories and hear enough things to have a fairly consistent sense of Eddie's work ethic, and of all the things that motivated him and drove him to be what he was.
You know, the Black Crowes were, and I've told you this to your face as well, Black Crowes to me were instrumental in my just music upbringing. And, you know, it was the bands that you mentioned, which were the grunge bands, but the Black Crowes felt a little bit like it was like dirty rock in the South a little bit. It was kind of a bit of what it felt like to me. As you're trying to describe music, it's tough, but that's what the Black Crowes felt like around that same time, where I was like, man, I kind of actually identify with this rock music a little more. And then, you know, as you grow up and you start to look back and listen to the music, and you put out a book, I was looking through the book when you put it out. How much crap did you get into for sharing some of those stories with about those guys?
None. Who's going to mess with me?
Did anyone reach out to you privately and go like, come on, dude, why you got to be a douche?
No. Oh, no. There's only two people that would probably be offended with anything I wrote. The problem with my book is that it's all true. So if anybody's going to say anything to me, especially the two people that you're referring to, my former partners, the brothers Robinson, they've spent their lives spitting out as much as they could and as loud as they could that we're honest. So it's kind of hard to build a reputation on. I call it like I see it, and then when somebody does the same thing, you have a problem with it. So I've not heard a word from either one, and I can't imagine I ever will.
The book, you got to check it out. It's called Hard to Handle: The Life and Death of the Black Crowes. It's a memoir. It came out May of this year, so it came out during the pandemic.
Well,
which
the paperback came out in May.
Yeah.
It's been out for over a year in hardback.
The paper, but you couldn't like do a new book tour on it. When I did my my books, paperback was like a whole new level because it was distributed. It was a little cheaper to distribute, so they put more out. You got to do press again, but because of the pandemic, I felt like you kind of missed out on that. Did you feel that way?
Well, I did it. I had a decent run. I mean, from September through, I guess the last event I did was in February. So, I did around 20 book events. It certainly would have been. The problem for me, as it turned out, I say it's a problem. I had just started my new radio show at right around the same time, and it wasn't as easy for me to just jump and hit the circuit right away. Just come flying out of the gate. So, it wasn't as coordinated as it could have been, I guess. But, the book has legs, like any book. For people that care about the band, it's always going to be there. And, that's it.
Is it weird to every night travel, play, be super close with folks when you absolutely cannot stand them?
No. You learn how to compartmentalize that stuff really early, actually, looking back. I mean, but it didn't start where we couldn't stand each other. The band started thick as thieves, you know what I mean? It was like we were kids who agreed on a dream and we put everything we had behind it. And it takes years before anyone's willing to stick their head up out of the sand and go, hey, I think I'm kind of miserable, or I think I don't trust you anymore. It's a long, long time before, at least it wasn't in the case of the Black Crowes, before we all felt comfortable saying those things or even admitting them to ourselves is really the first step. There's a lot of love and there's a lot of betrayal and there's a lot of fear and loathing and insecurity and arrogance and all those sort of things just on kind of hyperdrive in a band like ours. And so by the time you were able to admit to yourself, this isn't what I was hoping for, you figured out how to play in just about any circumstance, in any situation. And if the band's still good, then you tell yourself, well, hey, man, look at what we just did on stage for 2.5 hours. It's worth it. Whatever else is going on, it's worth it to be in a band like this.
Do you guys have any bands that you hated, like that you saw playing, and not because they weren't good, but because just as people, you were like, they're not for us and we don't want to be friends with them?
Yeah. Oh, well, my band was the worst at having a long list of bands we didn't get along with. I mean, I'm a pretty agreeable dude. I get along with just about anybody, but my partners weren't that way. And as a band, our reputation was definitely a bit standoffish. I mean, it's like the mindset of the Black Crowes was we either love you or we have no time for you. Not necessarily hated you, but, if we didn't embrace what you did, it was kind of like, yeah, whatever. I mean, there were some amusing things over the years. I'm trying to think if there was when Shake Your Moneymaker came out, we got lumped in with Slaughter and Skid Row and a lot of bands that we had no regard for, and we did cross paths with those guys sometimes. And we were, for better or worse, one of the few bands who would actually look at some other band and go, dude, I don't want to talk to you. I don't like your music. I think you're a clown. Just leave. This isn't going to be good for you. You know, we actually acted like that to other bands in the early days. It was kind of funny to us too. You know, we all grew up watching Bill Murray movies. We were all just trying to be like that guy in Stripes, but in a rock band on a certain sense. But then, you know, it's weird to open up a magazine and see a band that you can't stand right next to you. And like back in those days, you'd see rock mags and it would be Reader's Poll, our two favorite bands, Warrant and the Black Crowes. And we'd be like, what? How are we in a magazine with Warrant? You know, and I look back now and I don't care about Warrant. I wish those guys well. I don't care about any of these bands. But when you're, you know, 22, 23 and you get your first shot at it, man, you take everything a little too seriously, or at least we did.
You know, a lot of my buds who are artists now, and mostly a few years ago before they started to settle down, but girls would reach out to them through direct message on Instagram. And so then that's how they would link up. That's how they would meet later, and they would do whatever they do later on. How back in the 90s would you guys meet the chicks that you would hang out with each city?
You know, this is the sad truth about the Black Crowes. That was hardly a priority for us as a band. You know, for me, I mean, I've been with the same woman since the end of 1990. I'm 30 years last month in a monogamous relationship. So, but you know, if I have to think back to before that, when we were on the road, it was just like it was when you're a local band. You just show up and meet somebody in a town and move on. It wasn't a question of, there was no thought to, I know bands that was sort of their raison d'etre, you know, like they hit the road and it was just a matter of surrounding themselves with women at all times. The truth is, you know, of all the things about the Black Crowes that made no sense, one thing that made a lot of sense was we were obsessed with being a great live band. And we got on the bus at the end of the night, and everybody was drinking and everybody was smoking weed in the early days before harder drugs moved into the scene. But we were listening to live bootlegs instead of partying in the dressing room with girls. We would record our shows and listen back that night and talk about where a jam could have gone farther, or where we went too far, or how do we get the rhythm section to carry this interim section between these two songs. I mean, we were obsessed with that in the earliest days, and I think a lot of bands hit the road and they're already sort of fully formed. We were making it up as we went. Like our first album came out, we hit the road in support of it, and we'd never played more than 4 nights in a row in our life, and suddenly we went on tour for 20 months. We had never toured before. We already had a song on the rock charts before we'd ever toured.
Wow.
So we felt like we had to make up a lot of ground. You know, we were coming from behind from the jump. And, you know, individually, I'm sure members of the band were doing whatever they could with women, but as a band scene, we never had a groupie vibe, ever. There was never, the word on the street was never, the Black Crowes are looking for women. It was always the Black Crowes are looking for drugs, if anything.
I got 2 more things to talk to you about. The first thing is, in the heyday when you guys are just knocking them out, who is the most famous fan that came up to you guys and was like, I'm just such a diehard fan, where you're like, holy crap, that's crazy because you're awesome?
It's a good question. We had a lot of athletes. There was a lot of pro athletes, you know, a lot of dudes, you know, football players and basketball players. As far as like, you know, a movie star or, I'm trying to think. I mean, because the ones we were most impressed with were just other musicians. Like the first time we met Malcolm and Angus Young of AC/DC, they were like, it's a proper band. You guys are great. We love your record. I mean, that meant more than, that's way bigger in 1991 than Julia Roberts coming up to you, or David Duchovny from the X-Files, or I'm just trying to think of people that we crossed. You know, it's nice, but we really were the band that, like, you know, we opened for Robert Plant on our first tour for 6 weeks, and the first show was at Red Rocks, and he burst into our dressing room to go, hey, guys, so glad you're here. I love the record. And, I mean, there's nothing better than that, literally nothing. Like, Robert Plant knows our names. What kind of weird world are we in all of a sudden? So famous person that wasn't into music would have been a long, you know, way back in second place behind those kind of things.
Well, and I want to end on this because we started talking about Eddie Van Halen, where Eddie and his brother were the two constants in Van Halen, the band.
Yeah.
They switched out lead singers, two wildly successful. Another, when the guy from Extreme came over, not so much, but I think, that band had kind of aged a bit as well. So I don't know that it was his fault exactly. But and you can speak on the power of Eddie and his brother and them being the force of that band. But to start it off with this, could the Black Crowes have switched lead singers and continue to move on? And how hard is that to do?
Yes, the Black Crowes could have switched out Chris Robinson at some point and still managed to find career if that's what we were concerned with, maintaining a career. Yeah, we could have found a singer that could act like a frontman, and we could have brought in outside writers to write songs that were sure to be hits. But everything about how we went about being the Black Crowes, none of it was guided by those thoughts. So really, on paper, yes, of course. In reality, not a chance. Chris was the engine that drove, that motivated, or, he led the band for better and oftentimes for worse wherever we were going. And his inspiration, it was the guiding light. And oftentimes I would say, I wish he had been inspired somewhere else or by something else. It was difficult, but it was just the reality of that band. I can't imagine how we would have functioned with somebody else because, it's like the Allman Brothers. They did very well without Duane Allman, but there was a vacuum that everybody tried to fill. They were successful, but the essence of what made that band so special was gone forever. If something had happened to Chris in the 90s, there's no way you can replace that. We could have been a functioning band, certainly. And like I said, we may have been successful, but it would not have been the same thing. And because Chris was the catalyst, he wasn't responsible for, he's not singularly responsible for any of it, but he was, you have to recognize what the catalyst is. And it was him. Duane Allman was the catalyst of the Allman Brothers, not Greg Allman. Noel Gallagher is the catalyst in Oasis. Could they have worked without Liam? Sure, but it would have been very different. It wouldn't have been the same, and that's the case in the Black Crowes for sure.
Well, how about Van Halen? You got, massive.
Well, it's all about Eddie. It's all about Eddie. This is sacrilegious, but honestly, Led Zeppelin could have worked if Robert Plant had checked out after a couple of records. That's Jimi Hendrix. That's Jimmy Page's band. That was his baby. He envisioned that whole thing. When you have a guy like Eddie Van Halen, David Lee Roth, for the people that don't know or don't remember, from 78 to 88, 89, he was as big a rock star as there was on the planet. Eddie Van Halen really wasn't a rock star. He married a TV star. He did a lot of drugs, but he did drugs and just went to his room and wrote songs. He wasn't he wasn't partying to be partying. He was just an addict at the end of the day who was obsessed with making music and doing it his own way. And he was the guy, it speaks to what we said at the beginning, just what a complete unicorn he was, that the band, that you could have David Lee Roth as your front man and still people went to see Van Halen and he would do a 10 or 11 minute guitar solo on stage alone. Do you know how long 10 minutes is? No one went to the bathroom. That's what everybody was there for. And he's just a total, no rules that any other band ever had to operate under apply to Van Halen. And that's because of Eddie Van Halen.
There he is, Steve Gorman. You can check out the book Hard to Handle, The Life and Death of the Black Crowes, a memoir, which the paperback came out in 2020. You can also follow him on Instagram at Steve __Gorman _. You had to get both those underscores in there?
I got both of them, man. I got late to the Instagram game. All the Steve Gorman versions were taken.
All right. And then Trigger Hippy. He plays drums in Trigger Hippy. So check that. What's Trigger Hippy up to?
Well, like everybody else, we're just waiting. We put a record out last fall, Full Circle and then some, and we were out touring. Again, we were on the road September to March pretty consistently. And I think our last gig was March 7th. And then like everybody else, now we're just on the sidelines waiting for somebody to wave a green flag.
Yeah. Well, appreciate the time. Appreciate you talking about Eddie Van Halen and how much he meant to you and rock music, and then catching up on the Black Crowes. Hope you have a good day, man. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you, brother. Take care.
Hey guys, it's Bobby Bones. Welcome to the channel. If you're new to the channel, subscribe and then go check it out. A lot of artists, a lot of songwriters, a lot of music. Welcome to the Bobby Cash channel.